Hey guys, Steve Ramsden here, and today I'm going to try and recreate the launch sequence from Apollo 13 using only a miniature rocket, some pre-keyed elements, and some compositing skills. Apollo 13 is another of those amazing 90s films that relied heavily on miniatures and practical effects. These were done by Digital Domain in Venice, California, and most of these shots involved filming with pieces of very large miniatures. The launch sequence is a really amazing scene, and as usual I wanted to have a go at recreating something similar on a serious budget. And if you like filmmaking and practical and visual effects, then hit that subscribe button and you'll get to see lots more. So first I needed a miniature rocket. Now of course I couldn't use anything nearly as big as what the filmmakers did. I started with a commercially available kit model of a Saturn V rocket, and the first thing of course I had to do was to build and paint the model. And even though this was pretty fiddly, I thought I could probably get away with it just for a few quick shots on camera. Next I looked back at the launch sequence in the film and picked a few key shots to try and recreate. The first one I tried was this shot here of the rocket just rising straight up past the camera. Now as you'll know if you've watched my video on filming Star Wars miniatures, it's often easier to move the camera than move the model. So for this first experiment I could simply set up the rocket pointing upwards in front of the green screen and worked out a method of moving the camera up and down the rocket. I did this by mounting my slider 90 degrees and simply moved the camera down the length of the rocket in a smooth movement. And although this was creating a portrait-shaped final shot, this didn't matter because of course I was planning to remove the green screen and the edges and just use the rocket from this shot. So that was a pretty easy method of filming the rocket supposedly rising up past the camera. For the next shot I wanted some kind of dramatic angle showing the rocket engine starting up, and because the rocket or the camera didn't have to move for this shot, I could just lie the model down sideways. Digital Domain filmed these scenes with real pyrotechnics, whereas I was planning to composite this in later. However, I did turn on a bright light source just out of frame because I figured this was one less thing to fake later, and you might as well have a real bright practical light source reflecting back onto the base of the rocket. Oh, please don't break. Okay, so this is the shot I really wanted to try and get. This is where the rocket whooshes up past the camera and we're looking down to the ground. And the only way to do that I can figure out is to mount this rocket sideways using these threads, which I'm really hoping don't break, because then that's the end of filming. And this way I can move the camera smoothly right past the rocket. And this will look like the rocket is shooting up into the air. Now, because the model is so small, it's a lot smaller than what they would have used to do the film, I need to get my camera really, really close to this model and use a very wide lens to try and make the model look bigger. And actually the only camera that will fit this close to the model is my little DJI Osmo Action camera. And every time I knock this model, then I need to wait ages for it to stop moving around because it's on these threads. This thing is really fragile and bits keep falling off it. I'm not sure if it's going to survive for much longer, so I'm just going to try and get whatever I can. And it's being supported by this terrifying looking thing as a makeshift stand. If you're going to suspend a delicate model from something, don't do what I do, kids. I've just built this crazy thing out of whatever I could find lying around in here. Which ironically, I think is how they saved the astronauts in the film. DIY movie making. So, using this method of the rocket suspended sideways, I was able to do these shots just by pushing the camera directly past the rocket. Digital Domain would have probably done these using motion control, whereas I was simply doing this manually at quite a high speed to get real motion blur. The next challenge though was looking at the original film, their camera had started much further away from their model rocket than mine could, because the slider is only about 1 meter long. So by carefully moving the slider just further up in the room, I was able to try and line up a similar shot which would increase the move from where the slider ended. And my plan was to try and blend these two shots together to produce one long camera movement past the rocket. So because filming with the model suspended sideways ended up being a success and the model didn't break, I decided to carry on and film a few other shots with it suspended as well. This could basically recreate a shot in the film where you're below the rocket as it takes off into the air. And once again I added a real light source right below the rocket engines, and I could get the shot of the rocket slowly taking off. Finally, I rehung the model again, this time vertically from the middle of the ceiling, and because you can tell that Ron Howard is a big fan of these sweeping camera movements, I decided to get the gimbal out and try one of my own. This again was moving down past the camera to make it look like it was taking off, only this time I used the gimbal to change angle and follow the rocket up into the sky. This produced another good shot which I thought would work well for a takeoff. Finally, with the rocket still hanging from the ceiling, I just did a wide shot again on the gimbal, starting high and ending up low, just to make it look like the rocket was was moving into the sky. And having run out of ideas and energy to film these things, I decided to move into the editing room. So, like a lot of these experiments I try, I was building this in Adobe After Effects and started by removing the green screens from these shots using Keylight. For this shot of the rocket moving directly upwards, I just did a little bit of realigning and re-rotating just to make it move in a straight line, and then it was time to work out a way of adding some digital scenery. Adding skies using stock photos wouldn't be a problem, but how would I get the launch site and the landscape right for all these shots? Well, I went onto Google Earth and found Cape Canaveral down in Florida, and I could actually see the launch sites where the Apollo rockets had been launched from. And so by looking at these from various angles in 3D, I was able to save some screenshots and use these as my backgrounds. So Google owns these, not me. This was just as a demonstration, but this is how I found my digital scenery. So for this takeoff shot, I could line up one of these screenshots behind the model and add a real sky element over the very basic looking sky seen in the screenshot. Then I could add some blur to those background layers and do some color correcting to the model, add some cinematic black bars, and add a slight wobble to the whole shot by attaching everything to a null object and adding the wiggle expression tool to the null object. Now in the film there's all this kind of debris falling off the rocket. I never quite knew what it was, but it looks kind of cool. So using some pre-keyed debris elements, I added those in over the rocket as well. And a slight glow over a separate adjustment layer at the bottom shows that the rocket engines are approaching. I cut away before you can see that the rocket engines are of course actually sitting on a chair. For the static shot where I'd simply laid the model down and I didn't want to put the model on the green screen because I would have got loads of spill from it, I just drew a simple mask to cut out the rocket from the background. I then just added some color solids and did more masking to create some kind of launch bay that we're seeing from the inside. Using some explosion elements which I lined up to the frame where the light had been switched on, I was able to duplicate these and add these into the rocket engines. And these are so quick that you don't really see that it's the same explosion copied and pasted. Finally then a large fireball on top completes the effect, and some smoke elements as well. I also experimented using some pretty fun 3D rotatable explosion effects which were provided as part of this year's 5-day deal for which I was an affiliate. For the top-down shot, I removed the green screen from the two rocket shots and was able to kind of blend them together just by time remapping the speed a little bit and by doing a fade between the joins. I didn't get the perspective quite right, but my plan was to use some of the fire elements under the rocket to disguise this. Next, I dropped in a top-down view of the Cape Canaveral launch pad and added a rotation, which I think is such a cool part of the original shot. On top of this layer, I could drop in some smoke elements and line them up with the launch pad, and then parent these layers to the background screenshot so that they would all rotate in the same way. Then I added another fire element under the rocket boosters and just tried to keyframe it moving with the rocket. I also used an adjustment layer with a glow over it to just try and overexpose some of that bottom of the rocket and hide the point where that dodgy change happens between the two shots. For some of the shots close up to the rocket engines, as well as using real fire elements, I also used the particle world effect that would look like fire from the rocket boosters. And if you want to learn how to use Particle World in more detail, check out my video on how to do the Doctor Who regeneration. I could duplicate this particle effect over all of the different rocket boosters and keyframe this to match the movement of the rocket. And then I dropped a few real fire elements on top. For some of these shots it's actually a flamethrower element and combined with an adjustment layer which has a glow over it. The gimbal shot was a little trickier because the perspective was changing. I was able to drop in more background scenery and then try and line up the horizon with the moment where the rocket boosters look like they are directly level with the camera. I copied and pasted the same particle and fire effects underneath the rocket boosters, and a Gaussian blur added to the background and changed to vertical only gave it some nice vertical motion blur as the rocket was taking off. And with that, all the shots were done and it was time to look back at the finished effect.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
Roger, we got a roll from
Tower cleared.
Roger, roll. Complete and engine program.
Happy movie making, and I'll see you next time.